All right, 11th and 12th grade. We're starting a brand new chapter, chapter 28, and this is your second lecture for Monday. So let's get started right away. Okay, we're going to talk about after World War II, we had a baby boom in this country. Baby booms are when you have a rapid growth of families. You're talking about men who had been overseas fighting in World War II for 2 years. That was the absolute limit, the time that you could sign up for. You had to serve for at least 2 years. And then women working in factories. And then you had that whole reuniting of married couples, families, the people who were engaged before World War II now getting a chance to get married. And as a result, is it really that shocking that there were lots and lots of babies born? The phrase boomer has become part of our vocabulary now, and it's the babies that were born right after World War II. However, saying to someone, okay, boomer, is just rude, so don't do that, okay? It's not nice. Billy Graham was an evangelist who held large tent meetings in Los Angeles in the late 1400s. He received national news coverage, which led to large televised crusades. Crusades meaning it was a revival, and they were usually in tents. But as he got more and more famous, more popular, he started selling out arenas, like where sporting events took place. And that became his number one way to reach people, was actually in sporting arenas. So he became one of the best known and respected people in America and throughout the world. Next, we have in 1956, there was an event that happened that's going to spark a lot of people to go onto the mission field, including my family. My parents were both moved by this story and decided that they were going to get on the mission field as well. In 1956, 5 young American missionaries were killed by Auca Indians. That's actually not the right term for that group of Indians, but for the life of me, can I remember what it is now? No. But the people who lived around this Indian tribe called them Aucas, meaning headhunters. Okay. And then they themselves did not call themselves that. They lived in the jungles of Ecuador. This was a tribe that was very skittish because they were really afraid of being killed and possibly eaten. The news media gave this story very prominent coverage. These 5 men actually did this kind of under the radar of their own mission organization. They were sent to go and work among the Indians of Ecuador, and they were working with one group, and then they heard about the Auca Indians, and Jim Elliot, who was really the leader of this little band, he heard about the Auca Indians, and he wanted to reach out to them, but he wanted to do it very quietly because he didn't, oh, sorry, it's right on there, Waodani tribe. He wanted to reach out to them, but he wanted to kind of keep everything very, very quiet because he knew how skittish they were. He didn't want a lot of people kind of coming in and messing up his attempts at communication with the Waodani people. And so he got together with Nate Saint, who's pictured right next to him, and he said, I have an idea, but I'm going to need you to fly me there, because Nate Saint was the pilot of the group. And so they started to seek out the Waodani people in the jungle by using Nate's plane. And they were able to make contact. The 5 men actually got a chance to talk to some Waodani people. There were 3 people that showed up on this little deserted beach where, they'd hoped to meet. It was the only place where they could land the plane safely. And they met the 3 and were having some kind of communication with them. But then the very next day, like, the rest of the Waodani actually showed up and killed all 5 of the men. Now, the 5 men did defend themselves to a point. They really didn't want to kill the Waodani. They wanted to reach them for Christ. But it happened very, very quickly that they themselves were killed. They were killed with spears and arrows. They were not eaten. They were not trussed up and roasted alive. That whole thing is just a huge lie that for some reason people today, when they're starting to tell the story, try to embellish what happened, and there's no reason to embellish the story whatsoever. These are men who worked really hard to try to reach people for Christ, and at the very end of their lives, when the one of the men who killed he actually killed Nate Saint. He was, and then later became the godfather to Nate Saint's son and helped to raise him. He said when your father was dying, when these men were dying, we were going to, like decapitate them, finish them off, when we heard singing, and the singing was coming from beyond the trees. And so that man, who he just died last month, actually, the man who raised Nate Saint's son and who was actually there and killed Nate Saint, he said we believe that was angels were there telling us to stop. And so we stopped. Now the men died, but they were ushered into heaven. And Nate Saint's son was raised by the man who killed his father, but that man became a Bible-believing Christian and a very good foster dad to Nate Saint's son. His name is Steve Saint. And he wrote a book called End of the Spear. And if you want to read it, it's fantastic. Really, really great book. The story about what happened to the 5 missionaries, the original missionaries, was written by Elizabeth Elliot. She was the wife of Jim Elliot, and he's considered a martyr because he died for his faith. So she wrote a book about her husband's missionary endeavor, and the story about the possibility of angels actually being there at the end, that was talked about by these women, and they weren't sure if they should put it into the book because they didn't think people would believe it. And it came out later that, yeah, all of the women actually believed this, but they didn't put it in the book because they were afraid that people who didn't believe in that kind of miraculous undertaking, like angels actually escorting the men home to heaven, they didn't want people's disbelief in that to discount the rest of the story. So they just kept it quiet. Now, she wrote the book Through Gates of Splendor, and she's the one who actually wrote it down, but it has information in there from all of the wives as they put all the pieces of the puzzle together. And then later it was made into a movie called Beyond the Gates of Splendor. So strongly recommend these books and the movie to you. I actually haven't seen the movie, but I have read Through the Gates of Splendor, and I've read End of the Spear, and they're really well done. End of the Spear is actually better. Okay, really, really good. Okay. Now, growing up, I grew up in a house where my parents actually went to Ecuador as missionaries long before I was born. And I grew up in a house where these books, the books where these illustrations came from, were part of our family library. And I used to be so jealous of that little girl because she got to live like where there's hammocks, and she got to swim in the river all the time and run around in like very few clothes. And I was just like so jealous of her when I was little because I'm like, that's the life, let me tell you. That is Elizabeth Elliot and her daughter. And then at the bottom, that is Rachel Saint, who my parents actually knew. Okay. Capital punishment. We're talking about the 1950s here and talking about what the morality was seen as overall. So let's talk about capital punishment. This is the idea that if someone takes a life, their life is forfeit. So it's execution of those who are guilty of murder. Okay. Now, a lot of people don't like this idea. They don't like the idea of taking a life when someone takes a life themselves. They see that as being unnecessarily cruel. This is a biblical thing that when someone is a murderer, there is a very good chance. And for murder, what we're talking about is they have premeditatedly planned it and carried it out. Okay, we're not talking about somebody accidentally killing somebody. That's not biblical either. That's not what the Bible teaches. It's about someone who's premeditated, thought about it, and carried out a murder. And that keeps the hardest criminals off of the streets and out of society. Unfortunately, capital punishment can be mistakenly assigned. And that's really important too. The Bible uses the standard of there have to be 2 eyewitnesses for capital punishment to take place. And that wasn't always used like in American courts of law because we're not part of the we don't follow the laws of the Old Testament in our culture. I mean, that's not our culture. That was the people of Israel, ancient Israel. But when we talk about using capital punishment as a biblical foundation, it's a foundational civil ordinance, you also have to look at what made capital punishment happen. And as a foundational civil ordinance, a most basic law, it was because two people witnessed this premeditation and the carrying out of a murder. That's what it was all about. So today, people are always trying to fight over the idea of capital punishment, that once somebody is in prison and they're kept in a cell block all by themselves, that maybe they can still contribute to society. That has nothing to do with it. What it has to do with someone who has wantonly taken another human being's life, do they deserve to be in society? And the answer is no. Now the next question is, do they deserve to die for taking somebody else's life, or do they deserve life in prison? That becomes the big question. Okay, since we're talking about killing an innocent, when we talk about capital punishment, we're talking about someone who is executed because they've committed the most heinous of crimes, the taking of another person's life. In abortion, the person who dies is completely innocent. They have not done anything wrong. It's just the fact that they exist that puts their life in danger. So abortion is the killing of babies before birth, and it was illegal throughout the United States in the 1950s. So you can see here, I know this is really uncomfortable. It's awful. I don't like to talk about it, but it's a it's a reality in the United States and around the world right now. So you can see the top picture is the uterus of a woman. That's the muscle in which the baby grows. The baby, the sperm and the egg meet actually in the fallopian tube, and then it travels to the uterus, where the child actually attaches to the side of the uterine wall through an umbilical cord, okay, and begins to grow and develop there. In an abortion, a curettage, which is this surgical instrument with a blade on it, is used to scrape the child out. And then the curettage is then used to scrape the entire inside of the uterus to make sure everything is out. It is then the job of whoever assists in the abortion to put all the baby pieces back together to make sure that everything has been removed from the uterus, because if anything's left behind and it's dead, it can cause infection. And so that's what the picture on the left is. It is an aborted baby. You can see actual little fingers. You can see the skull. You can see the intestines splayed out. That is the job of the person assisting, an abortionist, to put all those little pieces together to make sure that they've gotten everything. And you can see the size of that child, and it is a child, there's a dime there to give you a sense of size. But at the moment of conception, a person has their own DNA, they have their own blood type, they have their gender already marked, they are already separate from the mother. They are an individual person at the moment of conception. Now, people in the 1950s, after World War II, they worked really hard. They saved their money, they invested their money, and they provide capital. That means they spent their money, which is important, for economic growth. So when they bought a house, that allows for builders to make money. You get a house, the builder gets money for building the house. You decide to decorate the house. Now the person who makes couches makes a little money, and you get a nice couch. You're buying all this furniture. The furniture makers make money. You get a nice piece of furniture. Rug makers are making money. You see how it goes when you spend money and we help each other, and both sides are actually getting a benefit from this. Now, after World War II, everything wasn't just peaches and wonderful and everything's great. Yay. Okay. I know sometimes it comes across that way when people talk about the 1950s, but we have to remember too that this is after the Second World War, when some incredible atrocities against humankind were committed. And a lot of our soldiers around the world who went home after World War II, They had to get back into the groove of working and working really hard to make their money. They had to get back into the groove of having a relationship with their families, whether it was their wife and their kids or their parents or brothers and sisters, and all the while trying not to remember the horrific things they had gone through during World War II. During this time, there wasn't a lot of help for veterans to discuss the feelings that they had. In fact, people talking about their feelings was often seen as a sign of weakness, when in reality, it was incredibly important for these men because a lot of them ended up turning to alcohol to kind of medicate themselves and give themselves a chance for their brain to just shut down at the end of the day. So cocktail parties became a really big thing where men would drink hard liquor at the end of the day in hopes of kind of being able to shut their brain down so they could sleep without nightmares. Women started using alcohol as well. They would have little cocktail parties and bridge parties, but women also started to use amphetamines, methamphetamines. Yeah, the precursor to meth. It was a prescription drug, and women did start using that. And then tranquilizers to go to sleep at night. So people were medicating themselves, but not really taking care of the underlying issues, which was PTSD. But on both sides, because honestly, when the husband is drinking because he's trying to shut his brain down after World War II issues, and the wife is just trying to make life pretty and nice, and people aren't going to be getting along, and they're going to start drugging themselves, and that is going to influence the children. And when the children grow up, there's going to be a huge rebellion backlash based on this kind of activity and the way people were living during the 1950s. There's going to be huge backlash. And that's really one of the big causes of it. Okay, now the productive years after World War II brought forth research and later development of jet aircraft, computers, lasers, and medical wonders. Yay. So people were coming back with really just wanting to move forward, wanting to escape the past and move forward. And that means research and development in a lot of different areas. Okay, to help the men and women who were coming back from World War II get readjusted to society, the GI Bill of Rights, or the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, made low interest rates available for government for veterans. Okay, these were government loans. They were available to veterans, and you could use those loans to purchase a house or a farm or a business, or you could go back to college. Okay, Levitt and Sons. They introduced the mass production of low-cost housing in the 1940s. It is still being used today, but it's no longer low cost. It's really expensive. We are having about 7,000 new homes being built right now using the same production idea, where everything's built pretty much at the same time. You build multiple houses all at once. Foundations are poured all on the same day for a couple of blocks, and then you have people go in and they do like all the plumbing and all the electrical. It's basically an assembly line type of process. But the Levitt and Sons corporation, they're the ones actually started this whole idea of mass producing low-cost housing. There was a huge need for low-cost housing because all of these people were starting new families and they needed a place where they could raise their children. In their neighborhoods that they had planned communities. They also included things like places for people to shop, grocery stores, and then also sports areas and parks. Okay, Levittown was the first really big one. It was a community of 6,000 homes, and it was outside of New York's Long Island. And they increased production and cut costs by mass producing homes in an assembly line fashion. So this gives you an idea of what it would have looked like. Lots of homes very quickly. It's really familiar because it's exactly what they do today. We see this happening. It's right in our area. If you ever travel through these new builds, these new neighborhoods, you get a really good idea of what Levittown would have looked like, except for their houses were a little bit smaller and more spread out. Ours are getting bigger. We're getting like McMansions here, and they had much bigger yards because people spent a lot of time in their yard. They grew not just grass, but they grew a lot of their fruits and vegetables right there in their own yard. Okay, the house building boom was linked to the shift in population away from the farm and into the city. With all of the new information about farming, new pesticides to prevent loss of crops, new fertilizers to increase the crop growing, and then lots of machinery to help with the planting and the harvesting of crops. You didn't need as many people on the farms, and people looked at the cities. They've always looked at the cities as a place where you can get rich quick. That's not really true, so don't fall for that. They're like, all the jobs are in the cities. There's plenty of jobs that aren't in the city, but a lot of people moved from farm to city, and they needed a place to live. Advances in crop production and increased use of machinery allowed more people to leave the farms. And this would have been a tip-top, brand new modern kitchen from the 1950s. And now we look at that and go, oh my, that is a kitchen. Oh, the oven in the wall. I lived in many houses that had that. And I did live in a house. Mr. S, the younger, was actually born. And his earliest life was in a house that had a pink oven and stovetop. Yep. So it wasn't in the 1950s, though. It was just a really old house and really, really old appliances. So things change over time. Tastes change over time. Okay, the suburbs. When we talk about a city, that's urban. And then below the city or outside of the city, that's called suburban. So short, suburbs. These were developed areas outside of a city. By the 1960s, more people were living in the suburbs than living in the cities. They would often commute to the cities, but they would live in the suburbs. They wanted that house of their own, a little piece of property of their own. That was, for so many years, the American dream. For me, still the American dream. I'm in my forever home. I'm very happy. I mean, look at my library. I mean, ha-cha-cha. Come on, that's good stuff. I've been waiting for that my whole life. So yeah, the suburbs. This was a way for people to experience the American dream by having a home of their own. But that means you may have to commute to work. So commuting is traveling from a suburban home to any office or factory in the city. Now, we joke in Banning about, we have to commute. The commute was really difficult today. When I lived on Wilson Street, I was 5 minutes away from the school, but sometimes I would tell Mr. S, how the traffic on my commute was just murdered today. Because I lived on Wilson itself, and my driveway went straight out into Wilson, which meant I had to wait until everybody passed me before I could pull out. But it was still a joke. It wasn't serious. I wasn't really complaining. Okay, as the suburbs continued to grow, they added industrial parks. That's jobs right there in the neighborhoods. And then recreation facilities. If you ask anybody who lived during the 60s and 70s, roller rinks and bowling alleys, that was what everybody wanted in their town. But they had recreation facilities and shopping malls. Really the first time we're going to see indoor malls too. Okay, metropolitan areas were large cities with suburban areas. So this would be LA, but it's also Hollywood. So Hollywood is like, it's in a metropolitan area. It's connected with LA, but it's a little section within LA. So it's when you have large city and suburban area. Now this whole place is suburban. In fact, if you look at the newest information on Los Angeles metropolitan area, even Riverside is considered part of the Los Angeles metropolitan area because Los Angeles just spreads out so much. Capitol Records was major corporation, major. It's supposed to look like a stack of records on a record player way back in the day. And then you'll notice the Universal Studios tour. Yeah, that's been around for quite a long time. This is not a new picture. No, look at the cars. This isn't a new picture. Okay. Better and faster transportation brought fresh fruit, vegetables, meat, and dairy products products, not projects, to new supermarkets in cities and towns. New technology increased the production and better preservation of food. Just using a refrigerator for a lot of your fruits and vegetables allowed those to have a much longer shelf life. Okay. And this is your garden room from Safeway Produce. This is always my favorite section in the store, even when I was little. And we used to go around and look at all the fresh fruit and vegetables. It was amazing. All the stuff that was right there at your fingertips for the first time. You didn't have to grow it in your own yard. Okay. During this time too, the polio vaccine was developed by Dr. Jonas Salk in the 1950s, and that ended the spread of the disease, ended it completely. That paralyzed parts of the body. If you got the polio vaccine, you didn't get polio. It was shocking. And later on in 1960, Dr. Sabin invented the first oral polio vaccine where you could actually take it in your mouth instead of having a shot. Okay, so Welby says, be well, take Oreo polio vaccine. Tastes good, works fast, prevents polio. Polio was an incredibly dangerous disease that caused such horrific paralysis that it wasn't just people not being able to walk, but sometimes the paralysis went all the way up into their lungs, and they had to have a machine called an iron lung actually breathe for them. So this was a really horrific disease, and people were more than willing to get their kids vaccinated for this horrific disease, and now it's pretty much wiped out. Okay, now when Mr. S and I were younger, like kindergarten age, okay, kindergarten, first grade for both of us. We did not live in the same town, but we did live in the same state. And we both have fond memories of vaccination day at school. That's how they used to do it. You didn't make an appointment with the doctor and go get your vaccinations. The doctor came to the school and vaccinated all the kids at the school. And because of that, a lot of the early diseases were completely wiped out. Completely. Now they're making a resurgence because people aren't doing it anymore. They have gotten that mindset, well, that disease isn't around anymore. We don't have to worry about it. The disease isn't around anymore because so many people have been vaccinated. That's the issue. But we have fond memories of the polio vaccine. And I'll tell you why. Back when we were growing up, I know you're all going, oh, back when she was growing up. Back when we were growing up, we didn't get a lot of candy. Either of us did. Okay. My family was not big on sweets. They liked ice cream, and I don't like ice cream, but they weren't big on candy. So we didn't get candy. My grandkids, they have candy coming out the wazoo. They love candy, but we didn't get that. So on vaccination day, yeah, you had to get jabbed in the arm too. But for the polio vaccine, they would take the polio vaccine and they'd drip it onto a sugar cube and put it in your mouth. And then you were able to suck on the sugar cube. And it was like the most miraculous thing ever because we got sugar. And I mean, we were like so excited about vaccination day because of that. Mr. S and I still talk about it because it was like we got so excited about vaccination day. And then some idiot came up with a polio oral vaccine, not Sabin, somebody else did this part. He was all about the, put it on a sugar cube. We're good. Somebody else came with this idea of prepackaging it in this little like plastic thing, and you just twist the top off and you squirt it under the kid's tongue and no sugar cube. And we felt so ripped off. There was almost a riot at my school. Okay, seriously, we were so mad that we didn't get the sugar cube. Okay. So, yeah, when my grandkids want candy, I'm like, have candy. Okay. This is the result of not getting the polio vaccine. People who are stuck in iron lungs, letting this machine actually work for them to help them breathe. People didn't live very long with polio if it affected their lungs and heart. We had a president who had polio, remember? So this was a big issue in the United States. It traveled through water, so when people swam in the same lakes or stayed in swimming pools, polio could be spread. And the biggest reaction from polio was paralysis of the lower limbs. Okay, vaccines were later developed against measles, which are a killer. About 3,000 people a year now still die from measles. They have not been completely wiped out. They were completely wiped out in the United States, and they're back. Mumps, which most people have never had mumps because they were vaccinated when they were babies. Diphtheria, which is truly scary because a membrane actually grows across your windpipe and you smother to death. Tetanus, which this unfortunate little boy on the blue blanket has tetanus. He is locked up and paralyzed. He's got what they call lockjaw, and that's from having dirt introduced into your system, an infectious dirt. And I believe, let's see, measles, mumps. I'm not really sure. I think that's actually tetanus as well. The open sore is also tetanus. And then whooping cough, which is truly scary. And unfortunately, that has made a comeback as well. And they are encouraging now grandparents to be revaccinated for whooping cough so that they won't spread it to their grandbabies, because an infant can't have the whooping cough vaccine, but they can catch whooping cough. And so they're telling grandparents, make sure you have the herd immunity so you're not spreading whooping cough to your grandbaby. The whooping cough is called that not because the cough sounds like a whoop. It's because the child is coughing, 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 and can't catch their breath. So they're actually smothering while they're coughing. And then when they finally can catch their breath, they breathe in really fast and hard. So it makes a sound. And that's the whooping cough. That's the sound that they make. And I'm choking now. So the vaccinations were absolutely essential for wiping out disease in the United States. Polyester was invented. Oh, yay. This is wash and wear fabric. You could wash it in the washing machine, hang it up on the line. It dried without wrinkling. Hallelujah. And the colors didn't fade. Why? Because it was completely man-made material. It made you sweat like all get out, but it looked pretty for a while until you snagged it, and then it was all over. So polyester became a big thing. And then people started criticizing it, and then it became like fashion no-no. Okay, Formica. And you'll still see this every once in a while, especially in restaurants. This is a very tough, easy to clean plastic. It covered kitchen and bathroom countertops and tables. You could get in a variety of colors and patterns. And so this became a really inexpensive way to cover tables and countertops. And if it, you set down a hot pan and it burned, it didn't cost that much money to replace. It was the colors that were really the big selling point, though. Formica. Okay. The television set. It replaced newspapers, radio, and magazines as the major source of news. Most were black and white. They had small screens, and the original televisions were actually circular, which is why televisions are measured on the diagonal, because it goes back to when they were circular, and that was the only way you could measure a round television was on the diagonal. I just learned that this week, like 2 days ago. I was so excited. But even today, even though we aren't there anymore, we don't have round TVs anymore, we still measure on the diagonal. But color sets did not become widespread until the 1960s. First, in the 50s, it was huge news if somebody in the neighborhood got a television. In 1960s, if you had a color TV, oh my word. Okay. There's even jokes about 1950s shows. Like, for instance, I Love Lucy. Lucy is depicted as a zany redhead, but people were watching it on black and white, and they're like, can't tell. She's a redhead. The only way people knew she was a redhead was looking at magazine pictures of her, and the fact that they kept referring to her as a zany redhead. That was it. Yeah. Okay, by the end of the 1950s, most Americans relied on 3 major television networks. You had NBC, which actually started out in radio, as did the other 2, but NBC was the first broadcast radio network, and we still use their little chime, NBC, that they used to use on the radio. They still use that on their television, like, network place cards and stuff. They became known as their their mascot became the peacock to show off the fact that they had many of their shows in color. Ah, good marketing campaign. And then there was CBS, which is just the giant eye, which is not at all terrifying and sad. And then ABC, American National, the American Broadcast Corporation, National Television. These became the three main sources. And then there was also the public broadcast system, which is really supposed to be the government's broadcast system, but it has kind of been hijacked. The government still pays for it. You pay for it with your tax dollars, but the people who actually run it don't usually support the government that's in control. It depends on it's very politically biased. Let's just put it that way. Okay, tourism became a major industry in the 1950s. People had increased leisure time and vacations were becoming standard for the average American. And it was one of the ways that businesses attracted workers. They would offer them a week or 2 weeks vacation as part of their payment plan, their package. They would offer them that, and people would be saving up for vacation, which meant that they could actually take rides on the roads. And Eisenhower, who became president in the 50s, he actually connected all of the interstates and created this new interstate system and encouraged Americans to take to the open road and go see their own country. It was really important. Now, a lot of these men who came back from World War II, they had seen more of foreign countries than they'd ever seen of the United States. And now they're being encouraged to take their families out and go and explore the world. Okay, in the 1950s, for the first time, people were traveling overseas by air rather than by sea. Before this, you could only take a cruise ship over to the European continent. Now people could just fly. And it took 6, 7, 10 hours, something like that. In 1958, the first passenger jet, the Boeing 707, was introduced. First jets. The jets were invented during World War II, but this is the first passenger jet. Okay, Walt Disney, creator of many famous cartoon characters in the Depression, during the Depression in the 1930s, also made his cartoons really important to the American propaganda machine during World War II, where he was really promoting the idea of recycling and being very aware of communism, Nazism, making people, some of his stuff got a little on the racist side, not going to lie. But for the most part, he was trying to promote the idea of American exceptionalism and supporting the military. So he began to build his first theme park in 1955 after taking his daughters to a boardwalk kind of theme park. And there were a lot of people who were there who were smoking and drinking on the boardwalk. And he's watching his girls and he's like, I'm not really comfortable with my kids being around this, and he's like, what we need is like a family theme park. And that's where he came up with this. So your book often calls this the first theme park. It was not. It was the second. The first one is actually Knott's Berry Farm, okay, which is also very family friendly. And it really was a berry farm that the guy who ran the berry farm added like little rides and attractions for when people came to buy his berries. And then his wife during the Depression started selling chicken dinners to make a little extra money for their family. And that started the chicken dinner restaurant outside of Knott's Berry Farm. Still the original place. Okay, so Disneyland opened in 1955. General Dwight David Eisenhower, former commander of the Allied forces in World War II, became president of the United States in 1953. He's the one who connected all the interstates. And if you watch Cars, they make it sound like it was the worst thing that ever happened because their town got bypassed, but that's kind of life, and you can have an exit ramp going to your town. You just have to have some reason for people to want to stop in your town. And also, if you're still complaining about the interstate system going in 50 years later, that's your own problem. You should have fixed something before that. You know what I mean? I'm like, you have 50 years to fix this issue. So either move the town, get an exit ramp, or have something great for people to want to visit you, which is what they end up doing, huh? Okay, Eisenhower's main goal was to ensure American economic prosperity. We're in the business of business, according to Calvin Coolidge, and Eisenhower is going to continue that on. But he also wanted to build up our defenses against communism, which was also really important because he had just fought a big honkin' war that was against fascism. And he had to ally himself with a man who was an open communist. And he realized really early on that was not going to work. That's not going to fly in the U.S. Okay. Eisenhower. I'm going to let you guys write that down. And on to the next one. Espionage. It's a fancy schmancy word that means spying. And we're talking about the Cold War now because we're after World War II. Alger Hiss, who people really didn't notice him so much, but he was one of the primary advisors to President Roosevelt at the Yalta Conference. That Yalta Conference, that was when you see Churchill and then FDR in the middle and then Stalin on the other side. And FDR's not looking all that good because he's going to die like it's like a week later, okay, in Warm Springs, Georgia. Alger Hiss is in some of those photographs. He's standing kind of behind FDR. He was one of the advisors to the President of the United States, but he was a communist. And not just a communist, he was a spy for Russia. So one of the advisors to FDR was a Russian communist spy. That's a little on the terrifying side. He was later convicted of perjury. That means lying under oath. That's illegal. In 1950, he had passed State Department secrets to a Soviet agent and then lied about it and said, no, I didn't do that. And then turned out, yeah, he had. And there was proof of it. Whittaker Chambers was a former Communist Party member and Soviet spy. He turned against communism when he realized its true nature and then became an informant for the United States. And I'm going to do the little quote here about what he says communism is, and it's so beautifully written. It is this: the communist vision is the vision of man without God. It is the vision of man's mind displacing God as a creative intelligence of the world. In other words, man becomes God. Man's ideas, philosophies become all-powerful and correct, despite the fact that we have a sin nature. Well, communism doesn't believe in a sin nature. And communism really looks at the individual person as being the vision of God. But of course, communism also looks at the state as being God, and they run everything. So communist vision is a vision of man without God. Okay. Chambers, when he was going to give the information specifically about Alger Hiss, he had a bunch of documents, microfilm, that's like little teeny tiny microfilm that can be read under a magnifying glass. He had all this information that would prove Alger Hiss was lying and that he was part of the Communist Party and he was a communist himself. And Chambers was ready to talk to the State Department about what he knew and that he had information about a spy ring that was being led by Alger Hiss. So on his farm in upstate New York, he had hidden these pieces of evidence, and he actually hid them in multiple places around the farm. But on the day that the State Department actually showed up to gather the information, Chambers led them to the pumpkin patch on his farm and reached into a pumpkin that he had hollowed out and put the information in. So he reached into, pulled it right out of the pumpkin and gave them microfilmed copies of secret State Department documents that belonged to the United States. They were our secrets that had been passed by Alger Hiss, and Whittaker Chambers got a hold of him. He's like, see, this guy is really, really honestly a spy. And they were able to arrest him. It's a great story. He can't make that up. If somebody did this on a 007 movie, nobody'd believe it. Oh, just go reach into my pumpkin. Now, the Soviets had an atomic bomb by 1949. And the people of the United States went, especially the State Department of the United States, said, how did that happen? We kept the secrets for the atomic bomb absolutely under lock and key. We kept the people working on this in like secret areas. There is no way that communist Russia should have gotten a hold of these secrets. Well, it turned out that a number of atomic scientists believed in the philosophy of communism or socialism. And so they were selling the secrets to the Soviets. And one couple in particular were Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. He was an engineer, and she was running a spy little network herself. The two of them were arrested, tried, and convicted of treason for leaking vital atomic bomb secrets to Russian agents, and they were executed for treason in 1953. They weren't innocent, by the way, because people like to rewrite history and say, these innocent couple, they were just the scapegoat. No, they were actually involved, heavily involved with spy networks. Okay, and we're going to stop right there because then we're going to get right into the McCarthy hearings, and that's going to be another really like in-depth lecture. Okay, so that was our second lecture today. Get homework done as soon as you can. Hoping to finish this whole thing probably tomorrow or the next day, this set of lectures. We're trying to get through it as quickly as possible. Don't forget, tomorrow, you also have to have words finished. We are going to be going over the last few chapters of that book, and you need to have all of your work in from words before the end of the school year. Our last day of school is actually the 22nd. However, since we're a little bit behind, I'm going to let you guys go until the 27th. Just so we can get everything in, because I know you guys are working really hard, especially in other classes too. I know for some of your math classes, it's slow going. So I'm going to give you that little bit of extra time. I don't have a problem with that. So I will talk to you guys again tomorrow. We'll be doing 1 lecture for literature and 2 for history tomorrow. And I'll see you then. Bye.